Okay, this is Marine Ecology Part 2, the rest of communities plus ecosystems plus key habitats. Okay, for the rest of community, we are going to look at methods of feeding, avoiding predation, avoiding competition, and then we'll look at ecosystems and biomes in the biosphere. So methods of feeding. Different organisms feed on different things, different ways of doing it. Grazing or herbivory is basically an animal feeding on plants. Now, they can either eat the entire plant or they can eat part of it. And if they're eating a phytoplankton, for example, a zooplankton is going to ingest the whole thing and eat it entirely. We still call them grazers um, or herbivores. But this green sea turtle, as you can see, just look immediately to the left of it, you see these bits of turtle grass kind of chomp down till they're tiny little nubs. So what they will do is they basically have this patch of seagrass about the size of a typical room, and they'll come around and they'll munch the grass down to nothing in those areas, and then it grows back and it grows back clean and healthy and fresh, high in nutrients, and it doesn't have a lot of encrusting organisms. So then it'll come back to that spot, munch it down all the way to the sand. And it might keep, several of these patches and kind of move between the patches. So that's an example of a marine grazer. Carnivores, in contrast, are going to have ways of ingesting entire animals. So this is a deep sea anglerfish. This is the female. The male is kind of tucked in here, living parasitically on the female. Because in the deep ocean, you don't find a mate very often. So once you find one, you just want to latch on, and that's good enough. The female then has to feed and can actually feed on things larger than herself. So she has these large jaws and that can extend open, a large distensible stomach that can then feed on things and a bioluminescent lure to potentially attract prey. Many organisms live through filter feeding. And suspension feeding is a good example of this. Basically, sucking water across their gills in order to feed on particles that are in the water, or waving their gills around, or waving their tentacles around in order to feed on things that are up in the water column. So they're feeding on suspended particles that are up in the water. In contrast, deposit feeders are going to feed on things on the bottom, but filter feeders are feeding on things up in the water column. So it can include the organisms on the last slide that are sessile, they're stuck to the bottom. It can also include organisms like this manta ray that basically move through the water and then filter particles through their gill rakers. They're acting as suspension feeders. Or this salt down at the bottom, taking things and putting this combined water flow across it. It can function as a filter feeder. Deposit feeders feed on the surface. So instead of a clam sucking water off of the top, having an intake siphon that's basically slurping the top layer of mud across, that would be a deposit feeder. Or this sea cucumber on the bottom has these 5 tentacles that it sticks out and kind of mops up the organic material off the surface. That's detritus feeding or deposit feeding. And then omnivory is a flexible diet. It can include animals, it can include plants, it can include uh, dead decaying organic organisms or detritus, just depending on which omnivore it is. So usually food web ecologists would say an omnivore is feeding on more than one trophic level. So we usually think of that in terms of feeding on animals and feeding on plants, but it also could be feeding on herbivores and feeding on carnivores. Could be considered to be an omnivore. All right, now how do we avoid predation? Well, one way is crypsis. This is camouflage, blending into the background. So this flatfish laying on the seafloor, having pigmentation that allows it to blend in with the surroundings. That both helps it avoid predation by larger things, and also it's sort of aggressive crypsis in that it can camouflage itself until a prey comes by and then it can ambush that. So this is both functioning as making it a more effective predator and making it avoid other predators that are larger because there's always a bigger fish. Here's an example of a cryptically colored sea dragon. It's a relative of the seahorses, lives near Australia. It's basically camouflaged like a bit of kelp or seaweed. And so it has all these feathery projections that don't really do much except help it blend in with the other kelp that's around there. So that helps it avoid predators through crypsis. Another is disruptive coloration, vertical bands or stripes that make it a little hard for a predator to kind of key in on where this is. In this case, one of the stripes actually goes through the eye, so it has a hard time knowing which end's the front end of the fish and the back end of the fish. Usually prey fish are caught by the front end and are swallowed head first. So it's easier for them to get away if they're grabbed tail first, and then the predator has to maneuver it around. So disruptive coloration can help with that. Counter shading is basically a form of camouflage for midwater organisms. So small prey, also large prey, can use it to sneak up on prey, but to have you avoid larger predators. And this is kind of the common coloration in a lot of fish. The top side is dark, the bottom side is light. So if you're looking at the fish from the top, it basically blends against the dark depths because it's dark. And if you're looking at it from the bottom, you see the white and it kind of blends in with the sky above. Also, if you see it from the top part is lit so that lightens that color. The bottom part is shaded so it becomes darker and it kind of blends in with the surrounding waters a little more easily. All right, one other type of anti-predator mechanism is called mimicry. And there's two types of mimicry. We're going to focus on Batesian mimicry. Batesian mimicry is where a harmless individual mimics a harmful one. So in this case, the filefish has evolved the color pattern that matches that of a pufferfish. Pufferfish contain toxins inside of their tissues, some of their tissues, and so if a predator eats them, it could mean death for that predator. The filefish doesn't have the toxin, but it has the coloration to make it look like the unpalatable pufferfish. So a lot of predators will end up leaving it alone as a result of that. Spines or armor are an effective way to fight them off. This is Diadema, the Caribbean spined urchin, and it has lots of spines that have kind of venom on the tip, or they're painful. It's able to protect you. Snail shell is effectively armor, and it can retreat within there to protect itself from predators. It's not always 100% foolproof. Some organisms are around it, but it's an effective deterrent most of the time. Aposematic coloration is warning coloration, and many organisms will do this when they have toxins or some sort of harmful chemical within them. So many of the nudibranchs, sea slugs, they'll either be camouflaged and blend in, or they'll have toxins within them. But it doesn't pay to have a toxin and then get eaten because you're dead. So many of them will have bright, brilliant colors as a way to advertise, I'm brilliantly colored and I survive anyways because I'm toxic. So you stay away from me, you don't want to eat me, is effectively what they're saying with this. So aposematic is a warning coloration. Schooling is an effective anti-predator behavior. The predator has a hard time zooming in on one particular prey item. If they do, they try to identify which one's weak or swimming weird. But a shark can go at a school of fish, and the school of fish just kind of parts and goes around it. And generally, it's pretty effective. Um, the zooplankton tend to avoid predation by vertical migration. If they were up in the water column, they'd be able to feed more, but they would also be seen by fish, zooplanktivorous fish, that would then feed upon them. So what they do is they'll rise up in the water column at nighttime, and then they'll sink down to the depths during the daytime. Maybe 100 meters, 200 meters down, which, if you're a 1 millimeter long zooplankton, that's a lot of movement. Sometimes it can be even less than that. But if you're caught up in the shallow waters during the daytime, you're very likely to be preyed upon. So that's an effective deterrent, and that leads to vertical migration. When you did that one lab with the OOI data, it looked at a site where there was a solar eclipse, and the migrating zooplankton that went down then sensed, oh, it's dark. Now I need to come up toward the surface. And the zooplankton moved upward during the solar eclipse, and then the sun came back, and then they started to move downward again. So very sensitive to light. Here's an example of this for you. You can see kind of the back scattering, and the peaks here are because of zooplankton, phytoplankton in the surface waters, but you're looking at 400 meters down. They're going to migrate from the surface waters and then sink down 400 meters vertically. That's a lot of vertical migration for something a few millimeters in length. Um, so avoiding competition is the next one. Now there's two types of competition: interspecific competition and intraspecific competition. Interspecific is between two individuals of different species. So Balanus or semi-Balanus and Thamellus. That would be interspecific. Intraspecific is within the same species. So semi-Balanus competing with semi-Balanus. Those are examples of that. And they can avoid competition by staying in different places. So avoiding the areas where they're going to get out competed by the other, and they can thrive in those locations. Now, different types of competition in a marine habitat. First is preemptive competition, basically exploiting a resource before the competitor is able to. So this is a sea anemone called an aggregating anemone. It basically, the larval forms in the plankton, it finds a rock, it settles on the rock, grows, feeds on things, and then it gets to a certain size and it will tear itself in two to divide, and now it's two individuals. And then they'll keep feeding, tear themselves into 4, tear themselves into 8, 16, 32, 64, until they cover that entire rock. They basically get to cover the rock before anybody else gets there. So they preempt all the space on that rock. They exploit the resource before the competitor is able to. Exploitation competition is being better at consuming the resource than a competitor. So this is a barnacle, and it has its filtering cirri or feeding appendages. And if it was able to extract more zooplankton than other fish in that area, other filter feeders, it would have outcompeted them through exploitation competition, dropping the resource to a low level. And a good example of this is the population density of two diatoms, Synedra and Asterianella. So Synedra is solitary, Asterianella is colonial. It forms these spokes like a wagon wheel. And both of them need silica in their outer shell. But Synedra is better at taking it up from the environment. So initially, both of them increase. And then Asterianella has kind of peaked. It's taken up as much as it can. And you can see the green, the silica level dropped, but Synedra can still take it up at that level. So then Asterianella keeps dropping and dropping because it's outcompeted by Synedra through interspecific competition. So exploitation competition in this case is consuming silica more efficiently than your competitor. Synedra being better at taking up silica from low concentrations in the environment, and Asterianella not being quite as good at that. So I already said it's interspecific because it is more than one species. Now, if you looked at Synedra at the carrying capacity, all the different Synedra cells are competing with each other, so that would be intraspecific competition. All right, another type of competition is called interference competition, physically fighting over a resource. So this could be two crabs fighting over a food item. Or in this case, an owl limpet, which is a snail, fighting against all of the mussels that are trying to encroach in on its territory and fighting for space. So as you can tell from some of my previous slides, space is at a premium in the rocky intertidal. And the owl limpet is a snail that basically farms algae. So it clears out a space and then it comes back and it scrapes the algae off. But it doesn't scrape all of them, it leaves some behind, and then the algae regrow, it comes and then scrapes some of the rest away. It will basically compete with anything trying to encroach on its turf. And so it will headbutt these mussels and basically break their byssal threads, physically fighting them over this little space on the rock. So here's what it looks like when it does that. So the head of the snail is on the left-hand side, and the arrow is showing its direction of movement. The mussel is attached here by these little byssal threads hanging down at the bottom, and the owl limpet pushing against it breaks those byssal threads. And then when all the byssal threads get broken, then the mussel's going to wash away if there's a wave that comes and hits it. So that's interference competition because they are physically fighting over the space to hold on in the rocky intertidal. Another example would be if another snail tried to come in. It has another trick up its sleeve. It can lift up its shell and then clamp it down onto the surface. And again, it's still interference competition because the two snails are fighting over the algae that are here, but the owl limpet's going to win because it's a really good competitor. We talked before about the rock barnacles and the stellate barnacles, Semibalanus or Balanus and Thamylus. They avoid competition by settling in different locations and then thriving where their competitor cannot exist. All right, near the end, I want to look at these key marine ecosystems and key habitats, including salt marshes, mangroves, seagrass beds, coral reefs, kelp forests, rocky or sandy intertidal, benthic habitats, pelagic habitats, and finally hydrothermal vents. So each of these key habitats is an important marine ecosystem, and these are found in relative abundance, and each habitat has unique organisms that live in those locations. So the things that live in a salt marsh aren't going to live in pelagic areas, or they're not going to live on a coral reef. Things in a hydrothermal vent aren't going to be found in the rocky intertidal. So each habitat has unique things that live there. So a lot of marine biology classes kind of will march through the key habitats. We're going to kind of concisely do that here in oceanography. All right, salt marshes are kind of dominant at mid latitudes. You get a little further south into semi-tropical areas, and they're kind of replaced by mangroves. But this is kind of the border between terrestrial areas and salt areas, but they're covered and uncovered by tides. So the organisms that live there, the marsh grasses, have to be able to tolerate salt exposure, at least to some extent. So as you go along a gradient from low elevation to high elevation, the things that live in the low elevation have to be salt tolerant because they're covered and uncovered by the tide twice a day. So Spartina alterniflora is one of those. Spartina patens lives a little bit higher in the intertidal. A little higher than that is Juncus gerardi. This is black needle rush. And then Eva fructescens lives then even a little bit higher. In areas that are disturbed, you can end up with an invasion of the invasive plant Phragmites australis. It especially does better when there's increased nitrogen input. So that can help Spartina alterniflora kind of crowd out some of the higher elevation plants. And then Phragmites then dominates the terrestrial border when there's more nitrogen input from runoff from over fertilizing your lawns, for example. All of these things. And then there are other plants shown here, high marsh forbs. They're occasionally, they're flowering plants. They're pretty. They're found occasionally kind of interspersed here. As you get to more tropical areas, the mangroves take over, and mangroves are woody plants that can tolerate some degree of salt exposure. And many of the mangroves actually are kind of island builders because they hold the sediment in place. More sediment accumulates and then it builds habitat. So really important. There are also certain organisms that live there and not a whole lot of other places. They also function as a nursery ground where basically small juvenile fish and invertebrates can live there, grow there, thrive there, grow more quickly, be more sheltered from predators in these locations compared to adjacent habitats. So it basically helps them in these vulnerable stages to find refuge. Again, the gradient from low elevation to high elevation, red mangroves in the Caribbean, red mangroves tend to dominate in those locations. So it's Rhizophora is the genus for them. Black mangroves will then grow a little bit higher. Red mangroves have these prop roots and aerial roots that kind of come down from the branches. The prop roots help to stabilize them within the sediment, which is kind of a little unstable. As you get then more sediment accumulating, you build up the land, and then it can transition and be taken over by black mangroves. Black mangroves live in these areas that are inundated, that are salty, but they're a little bit higher elevation, so oxygen is more of a concern. So they have these little straw things sticking up from their roots called pneumatophores, help to transport oxygen down to the roots. If you get a little more well-developed, a little bit higher, those can be replaced by white mangrove or buttonwoods, which are, again, trees that are adapted. They're not as able to tolerate full salt exposure, but they can deal with some salt exposure. And then you get a little bit higher and you transition into tropical forest. The red mangrove actually has the seedling germinate on the tree, which is a really cool thing. We call them viviparous plants. They basically give birth to live young is like what it looks like. So if the seed is germinating and it can get a foot long before it falls off of the tree. If it's low tide, then it basically plants it there in the mud and it will send down roots and it can grow in that location. If it's high tide, it drops to the water, floats around until it touches bottom, or the bottom tip gets waterlogged and kind of pulls it down. But this can allow it to settle in new locations and then put out roots, grow more leaves, grow more branches, put out prop roots to help hold it in place, grow large enough, and then start germinating seeds of your own. Get a little further inland, this is a black mangrove. If you look down at the bottom of this picture, you'll see these little straw things sticking up. They are the pneumatophores that help to transport oxygen down to the roots. So this is kind of in a salt flat area near San Pedro in Belize. And this is a closer, they're not really straws. They're not like open at the tip, but they're porous, and that allows for oxygen to move through them down to the roots. This is turtle grass. It lives offshore in shallow areas. Often you'll find it in the lagoons in between the mainland and the coral reefs. And it has to be shallow enough to be able to photosynthesize. But you can see lots of organisms will kind of encrust on it, little bryozoans and things like that. And other small fish will live inside of it. So here's a fish camouflaging itself with its green color, hiding in with the turtle grass. Many coral reef fish will move away from the coral reefs at night to go out into the turtle grass to actively feed. So finding the fish and invertebrates that hide there. Here's a coral reef. This is again off near San Pedro in Belize. Ambergris Caye is the name of the island. And these are areas that have high biodiversity, lots of different forms of corals, lots of different forms of fishes that are living there, lots of different forms, stony corals, soft corals, you name it. We see grouper here on the upper right-hand side. A blue tang is the kind of circular yellow fish at the bottom. The juvenile blue tang is yellow. It grows up to be larger and then it turns blue. There are cleaner wrasses, which are the little black and white ones that are next to it. And then in the upper left, those are sergeant majors. So lots of different types of fish that can thrive within these areas. Each little microhabitat can potentially have different species living and hiding in them, and they can then thrive there. This is a kelp forest in cold waters, generally with upwelling. These can thrive. On the west coast of the United States, the kelp Macrocystis pyrifera basically can grow 1 meter a day. And it holds onto the bottom with a structure called a holdfast. It looks like roots, but it's not really roots. It just holds it there. It doesn't take up nutrients, but the nutrients are taken up directly from the water column. So it has a series of floats, these little gas bladders that help to hold it up. And once it grows enough, it basically will have this kind of carpet along the surface of the water where the organisms are photosynthesizing. But as you can see, lots of organisms living in and around it, like this Garibaldi, the state fish of California. In the rocky intertidal, again, there's a real strong zonation pattern. Higher you get, the less water there is. If you're in the splash zone, you might get splashed once or twice a month by the highest of the high tides. If you're in the low tide zone, you might get uncovered once a month or something, or it might be lethal if you're that intolerant to it. Things that live in the middle basically get uncovered and covered twice a day. Or they might get, if they're higher, they might only get uncovered by or covered by spring tides, or uncovered by spring tides if they're at the lower end. And this difference in physical features then impacts what organisms can survive there. And then that unleashes a set of competition and predation. The higher you get in the intertidal, the more physical drying is a factor. So periwinkles and limpets are very good at dealing with that. Barnacles, some of the bladder wrack, spiral wrack can deal with some drying. Further down, mussels, anemones, they can deal with less drying. And then below that, the kelp forest, the faunal turf, some of the benthic invertebrates have to remain covered by water all the time. Benthic areas in shallow zones then can have a range of different predators that are adapted to living in sandy bottoms. So in the fauna living in the mud, in the sand, uh, as well as mobile organisms that kind of cruise around the top or remain stealthy along the surface. The pelagic zone has organisms that can deal with open ocean. So counter shading is an important strategy that helps them blend in. Schooling can help both the anchovies on the bottom right and the tunas to the top help them to be able to survive. And then the microscopic organisms like this Callione copepod can thrive within those areas by migrating vertically. So we've gone through these different zones of the ocean. So the photic zone is going to support photosynthesis. The pelagic zone is offshore. Beyond the continental shelf, it's the oceanic zone. You can have pelagic living still within the Nereid zone if it's up in the surface, and benthic is anywhere along the bottom. So these jellyfish could be in the open ocean or more likely in the Nereid zone. And then the intertidal zone, covered and uncovered by tides twice a day. And then in the deep sea, in around hydrothermal vents, you can get these really rich communities that are actually fueled by chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis, chemosynthesis. So this is Riftia, the giant tube worm. These guys can get 5 or 6 feet in length, and they basically take up sulfur from the water and oxygen, and then use that to feed bacteria that live symbiotically inside them. And the bacteria then can undergo chemosynthesis, so they can then feed on some of the bacteria, and that it then supports this fairly rich and abundant food web in a pretty desolate location, really hot temperatures. It's not like immediately around the black smokers, but they're adjacent to the black smokers. So here's an example of what the tube worm looks like. They have this long tube, and then they have this structure, the vestimentum. They're called vestiminiferan tube worms, and they'll live inside the tube, and then they have this gill plume sticking out of the top. It takes up oxygen, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and then it basically is then reacting with the endosymbiotic bacteria that live inside of them. So the bacteria can live inside some of the cells in the trophosome, and they can then convert H2S into other chemicals through sulfide oxidation. By combining that with oxygen, they can then use that to fuel the Calvin cycle, which basically helps to generate ATP and the chemicals that then allow them to extract a lot of energy. In this case, it's from the chemicals themselves, from the sulfide being converted to other forms. And so that then helps to fuel chemosynthesis. And then from there, other organisms then can eat the tube worms or eat the bacteria and then grow and live surrounding this area. So here's some examples of different organisms. You can have free living microbes. You still get marine snow there, but that's less important compared to the symbiotic bacteria. You can have crabs and things like that, giant clams living down here, octopus, predators like this eel. All of these can thrive and grow in and around where because there's other organisms for them to feed.